Hello, and welcome to The Whole Life, the podcast that seeks to connect the Christian story with just about everything. I'm Paul Woolley.
And I'm Grace Fielding, and our topic for today is the abolition of the slave trade. Yes, it's a big one today, Paul. So I thought maybe before we start, I'd maybe set a bit of context for us, but also for our listeners. So if we head back to 1807, after an 18-year campaign, what's now known as the Slave Trade Act abolished the slave trade in the British Empire. But it wasn't actually until 1833 that the Slavery Abolition Act abolished slavery itself. Gosh, that's quite a tongue twister, that is. And even then, slavery didn't stop immediately. So I suppose some of the questions that I've got on my mind coming into today's conversation are, who actually led this campaigning? How did they go about it? And then what's the connection between the Christian story and the abolitionist cause?
I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation, Grace. And I'm actually not that far from Bristol today, which was, of course, one of Britain's key slave trading ports, and also where the statue of Bristol-born slave trader Edward Colston was toppled back in June 2022, I think it was. What do we think about that? Was that a good thing to have happened? Well, we are very lucky today to be joined by a great historian. His name is John Coffey. He is Professor of History at the University of Leicester. He's been there since 1999, and he works on religion, on politics, and ideas in the Protestant Atlantic world between 1600 and 1850.
And Paul, am I right in thinking that you actually have a quite special connection with John?
Well, that's generous and awkward of you to say that, Grace. Yes, I do. So John was relatively briefly my PhD supervisor. I began a PhD looking at the abolitionists and their use of the Bible before the pandemic, this was, and before I joined LICC. And in part due to both of those things, I'm afraid I had to put it to one side, but not before I read every word of Wilberforce's diaries, which was just an extraordinary experience, an extraordinary thing to do. Anyway, let's welcome our special guest, John Coffey. John, thank you so much for joining us on The Whole Life. It is great to see you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Paul and Grace. Yeah, and thank you for referring to your unfinished business, Paul.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for referring to it again, John. You're at Leicester today, I assume. I think that's your office. I recognise.
That's right. Yeah. I'm at home, but in Leicester. Yeah.
Brilliant. John, let's start with the context. Could you firstly give us a short history of slavery in the Atlantic world? I mean, what actually is the Atlantic world? Is that the right term? What was the scale of the problem? I mean, what was the scale of the slave trade at its height before the campaign for abolition began?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the Atlantic world is a term historians have been using for the last generation or so to refer to the world that was sort of opened up, I suppose, after Christopher Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic in the 1490s, which reconnected the Americas with Eurasia. It's one of these epochal turning points in human history, and it has massive consequences because of what we call the Columbian Exchange. So the exchange of plants, potatoes and tomatoes, for example, come to Europe. The exchange of animals, horses go to the Americas. Diseases, smallpox, of course, tragically, has a devastating effect on indigenous populations in the Americas. But it's also the exchange of people. And when we think of that, we tend to think of the migration of Europeans across the Atlantic to found new colonies in the Americas. But actually, until the 1820s, the number of Europeans voluntarily migrating to the Americas was outnumbered by the number of forced migrations of Africans. So that often surprises us, I think, when we hear that this forced migration, one of the greatest forced migrations in human history, outnumbers the European settlement in the Americas up until the 1820s. And it's huge in scale. So historians now have a really clear handle on it because of the shipping records from Europe. And so there's an amazing database that your listeners can log on to, called Slave Voyages. And Slave Voyages lists all of the different voyages from slave ports across Europe between the about 1500 and the end of the slave trade in the 1560s. The 1860s. So in that time, there are something like 12 million Africans who are transported across the Atlantic. So an
Extraordinary.
enormous number. And of course, there'd been slaveries before this. I mean, it's not that the Europeans, early modern Europeans invented slavery, but this is on an enormous scale. It's also, of course, ripping people from one continent and transporting them into another, transplanting them into another. And it takes an enormous human toll. So it's estimated that about 10% of those who travelled across the Atlantic on the slave ships through the so-called Middle Passage, that they died on board the ships. That's about 2 million people in its own right. And then the labour regimes in the New World were particularly brutal. So especially in sugar colonies in the Caribbean. So very, very high death rates, low birth rates. So it's a particularly brutal system of enslavement. And it's also, of course, racialised. And partly for that reason, it's hereditary. So in a lot of previous cultures, enslaved people had quickly become absorbed into the wider culture, whereas in the Americas, Africans, those with the black skin, are marked out racially. And so it's transmitted down from generation to generation. And the British are absolutely in the thick of it. They come into it relatively late, after about the middle of the 17th century. But by the middle of the 18th century, the British, and this is the time of Colston and Bristol, and when Liverpool especially comes to the fore, Liverpool becomes the major slave port in Europe, and the British are involved in transporting over 3 million Africans across the Atlantic in a relatively concentrated period of time, especially between the middle of the 18th century and 1807, when the trade is abolished.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? Given what the population of the UK would have been at that stage, 3 million people is massive, isn't it? So in the 19th century, then, a number of individuals emerge who campaign against the slave trade and then eventually slavery itself. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What motivated them to start campaigning when they did?
Yeah, I think we're often, students especially, are often puzzled by why anybody ever endorsed slavery, why respectable people, if you like, endorsed it. Looked at in historical terms, historians have sometimes been puzzled by the other question, is why this abolitionist movement suddenly coalesces in the later 18th century, because there had been nothing like it before. Slavery had been accepted in civilizations back from antiquity. It comes from different places. So some historians would emphasize the role of the Enlightenment, this new intellectual movement in the 18th century, which is particularly concerned about the betterment of humanity in the here and now. It's less preoccupied with the afterlife, more preoccupied with reform in the present. But often Enlightenment philosophers will be critical of slavery, but they won't necessarily do anything about it. They're not activists. And actually, the record of Enlightenment thinkers on slavery and race is a very mixed one. So figures like Voltaire or Kant or Jefferson are on record saying very racist things. The same is true of someone like David Hume. Someone like John Locke, great Enlightenment philosophers, invested actually in the Royal Africa Company. So although he's a great philosopher of liberty, he's got his hands dirty really with complicity in the slave trade. So the group who really begin this agitation are a small religious sect who are still with us, of course, the Quakers. That sort of interested historians. Why is it that the Quakers are really at the forefront of this? And I think some of it's to do with the conflict, the tension between their tradition and their current status. So they'd begun as a marginal religious sect. But by the middle of the 18th century, they're still very small, but they're also very affluent. And many of them are merchants. Many of them are invested in the Atlantic trade, including the slave trade. And this seems to be a tension with their own self-understanding as being these radical followers of Christ who stand out against the mainstream. And so in the 1750s, you begin to get Quakers who protest against this. An earlier figure, there's actually a play about him recently, Benjamin Lay. There was a play in London, and there's a book, there's even a graphic novel about, or graphic history about Benjamin Lay's career. Another one is John Woolman. And these figures challenge fellow Quakers and say, this is not compatible with our values. We're just going along with the flow when we should be countercultural. And then in the 1760s and 70s, a man called Anthony Benezet, who's a Quaker based in Philadelphia, he starts to build networks that go beyond the Quakers, and he really starts to establish an abolitionist movement that crosses the Atlantic.
So interesting, isn't it? I suppose a couple of reflections there. One would be around the theology of Quakers. I suppose central in Quaker theology, probably now, certainly then, was a sort of anti-hierarchicalism, if that's a word. So a sense of the equality of people. So I guess that would be a driver against the notion of slavery, and then would be a kind of motivating factor in terms of campaigning against the slave trade. But interesting as well that Quakers were, amongst the first to be involved in it, or at least complicit with it as merchants, but then amongst the first to be campaigning against it. And then, of course, most of us probably think immediately of William Wilberforce when we think of the slave trade and those that campaigned against it. Tell us a little bit about him. I mean, he's an iconic figure. Who was he? How did he come to be involved really as perhaps the leading campaigner, certainly in Parliament, against the slave trade? What was he like?
Yeah, so Wilberforce is an Anglican, so he's not a Quaker. He's part of the established church. He's educated at Cambridge. He's a close personal friend of William Pitt, who becomes Prime Minister at the age of 24 in 1783. So he is part of the British establishment to a greater degree than the Quakers, though he also comes from a merchant background. So in that sense, his family and his cousins are merchant bankers. And so they have Quaker connections. There are plenty of Quakers who are merchant bankers in this period. 8 of Wilberforce's cousins become MPs. So that gives you some idea of this new money, if you like, this new wealth that's coming up, the rising middle classes. And in some ways, he reflects the new confidence of the middle classes in challenging traditional values and asserting themselves. As I said, he's educated at Cambridge. He becomes an MP straight out of university because of family money. He's MP for his hometown in Hull. Then he becomes MP for Yorkshire, which is England's largest county constituency. So it's actually quite an important constituency to be MP for. But at this stage, there's no sign really that he's going to be a major reformer. I mean, he later says that he was opposed to slavery and the slave trade, even as a young man. But there's no sign that he's going to be a particularly significant figure. And it's his religious conversion in the middle of the 1780s, his religious awakening, which seems to shift things. So he goes on a tour of the continent. MPs in those days had quite a lot of time out of parliamentary session. You could have months to kind of travel and stay with friends and go and see the south of France and Italy. So he goes on a long tour, and while he's on this tour, the friend he's with turns out to be a very serious Christian, and they end up reading religious literature and reading the New Testament in Greek and discussing it together. And this leads to a kind of religious awakening on Wilberforce's part. And I think there are a couple of things about it which are significant. One is he's been quite religiously complacent up to that time, and suddenly he feels that his own soul is in danger, and that up to now he's been a merely nominal Christian, whereas actually he needs to be a real Christian. But there's also a sense in which he projects that onto the nation as a whole. That Britain professes Christianity, but actually it's sort of skin deep. And that it's in a more serious moral situation than it thinks. That it's actually under divine judgment, for its sins. And then some of his early mentors are people who are quite agitated about the slave trade, and one of them is this extraordinary figure, John Newton, who's a hymn writer, the author of Amazing Grace, but it's also got this very dark, shady past as a slave trader. But by this stage has repented of it and mentors Wilberforce and encourages him to take up the cause in Parliament.
Yeah, amazing.
I
Thank
had
you.
no idea. I don't know about you, Paul, but I obviously John Newton is a name that we all hear largely because of his writing of Amazing Grace. But I had no idea that he was. Did you say he was Wilberforce's mentor? I
Yeah,
feel like it's
so
all sort of
after this awakening, Wilberforce deliberately
yeah,
goes and seeks out Newton.
interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they see quite a bit of each other in those early years. Mm.
Yeah. It also made me wonder when you were talking about Wilberforce going off on his travels. Gosh, what would happen to all of us if we took a few months out? And I wonder what sort of awakening we might come back with, wanting to campaign against
He
all
does have
sorts.
time to reflect and to read actually, and the reading is he does a lot of religious reading after this point, but he's also quite well read in Enlightenment thought and in Scottish Enlightenment writers. So
Yeah.
maybe we don't give our MPs enough time to develop that kind of
Maybe that's
intellectual
the
culture.
answer.
Well,
You
I
know,
think
because
Maybe
it's so
they
24/7 now. They're having the leisure to actually think through your own view of things is something that
maybe the state of the country would be a very different
yeah,
place
possibly.
if we let
might
them
be
go off for a
improved.
couple of months.
Yeah. I mean, 6 months after you get elected to Parliament. I mean, that sounds. I don't think that would go down well in the press, would it?
What a
Just,
luxury.
just tell us, John. Just what did he look like, so that people have got
Mm.
a kind of image? Because there's a great quote, isn't there? Was it James Boswell or someone
Yeah.
who talks about this shrimp who then becomes a whale? So that suggests that he's small. And tell us about
Big?
that.
Yeah, this is the great age of political cartoons, and the great cartoonist of the age is Gilray. And actually, all of us, I think, even if you can't place it in your head, everybody will have seen Gilray cartoons because they, in some ways, lie at the back of all modern caricature. And Wilberforce appears in quite a lot of Gilray cartoons, and he's always this tiny little figure. He sometimes has the slave bill poking out of his pocket. He sometimes has a religious tract in his hand. Um, but he's this tiny, slightly hapless figure with a turned up nose. And he was just over 5 foot, maybe 5'2".
Ah,
So he is
Wow.
a small man. The other famous abolitionist from this period is a man called Thomas Clarkson. And Clarkson is huge. He's a big burly man. He was at Cambridge a few years after Wilberforce, and they both went to St John's College. But they're entirely different figures. And Clarkson can sort of handle himself when he's being bullied when he's doing his tours of Liverpool and Bristol. He's a major unit, as my children would say, I suppose. Whereas Wilberforce requires a bodyguard. He is at one point he is threatened by a slave ship captain, and he requires a bodyguard to protect him for a number of months.
amazing.
I feel like I've got much more of a picture in my mind now. I wonder if we can maybe just sort of talk about the actual arguments
Mm,
themselves. So obviously we talk about, campaigning, figures like Wilberforce, but what perhaps in, like, for example, the writing or the speeches that would have been heard and sort of distributed at that time, what was actually in those, if that makes sense.
yeah. One thing I think to say initially is that for political purposes in Parliament, they're targeting the Atlantic slave trade, and they're not arguing for emancipation of enslaved people in the Caribbean. So they
Okay. And
deliberately
sorry, I was going to say, before you answer that question, why was that? What was that distinction?
Yeah. So if you read a lot of the popular abolitionist literature at this time, they don't really make that distinction. They often attack slavery per se. But in
Okay.
Parliament, what the abolitionists calculate is they've got no chance at all of getting a ban on slavery within Parliament. And part of that is because of property rights. So property rights
Okay.
for the British elite are absolutely sacrosanct, and in law, you can hold property in persons. So
Okay.
this would be seen by a lot of the political establishment as an attack on property, and therefore undermining the whole sort of ethos of the property being sacrosanct in Britain. So they are very, very wary about that, and it's not until the 1820s that they explicitly start to attack slavery itself in Parliament. So the focus is on banning the Atlantic slave trade, stopping
Yeah.
the slave ships going to West Africa and bringing people across the Atlantic. Yeah.
Okay. And so, if we were alive in that time, what could we have expected to see in, because you talk a bit to do with, whether it's posters or
Mm.
things going through people's doors, or what was the kind of what was the campaign like, sort of from the outside view?
So the campaign is extraordinarily creative. I mean, it explodes almost from nowhere around about 1787 when the Abolition Society is founded, and it involves an enormous range of people. And there are lots of poems, for example, published, and this is often where
Okay.
women play a really important role in the abolitionist movement. Someone like Hannah More, for example, writes a poem on slavery. But there are sermons, lots of clergy preach sermons against the slave trade, pamphlets, treatises, parliamentary speeches. Eventually, there'll also be medallions. So Wedgwood, the famous potter, creates this medallion, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This famous emblem of a kneeling enslaved African with that slogan around them. So the abolitionist movement is often seen as, it's sometimes seen as the first human rights movement in terms of its ability to mobilize a large section of civil society and be very creative in the kind of media and the different ways in which they make their case.
Mm. And you mentioned earlier just about the sort of bit earlier on the sort of the place of the Quakers and all of
Mm.
this. So if we kind of go down that sort of Christianity Bible route, was there evidence? What sort of evidence was there of the Bible in, whether it was pamphlets, speeches, poems? I know you mentioned sermons already.
Yeah, so I mean, the Bible is used pretty extensively. So yeah, obviously that's true in sermons, but it's also inflected through poems. You'll find biblical texts as well emblazoned on medallions, abolitionist medallions. There's one that struck in 1807 to commemorate the abolition of the slave trade, which has the text, "I have heard their cry." And it's an image of Britannia. So in some ways, this is about Britannia sort of hearing the cry of those on slave ships. But it's also an echo of the book of Exodus, where God in the book of Exodus hears the cries of the enslaved Hebrews in
Mm.
Egypt. So that's one example. By the 1820s, biblical texts are even being used on tableware. So you'll have plates and jugs with text like "Release the oppressed" on them.
Yeah.
The use of biblical texts is not just in sermons, not just in treatises, but it's also in material culture as well.
Mm.
And I guess, John, obviously there were people like Wilberforce and others who were massively informed and formed by the Bible, and that influences them and helps in terms of both how they think about the slave trade, but also how they argue against it. But then there would have been those also that would have used the Bible as a prop to justify it.
Mm.
Can you tell us a little bit about them and the extent to which, if you like, there would be kind of argument between both sides, but if you like, using the Christian story to kind of justify either position?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ottobah Cugoano, who's one of the leading black abolitionists of this period and a devout Christian himself, he's a kind of Calvinistic Methodist. He complains that the biblical case for slavery is the great bulwark of those who defend the slave trade. So it is being used, and they're appealing, of course, to the normality, if you like, of slavery in the ancient Near East, among the Hebrews, but also the Greeks and the Romans. And it's an interesting example, I suppose, of how readers of the Bible locate themselves within the story, because those who defend slavery and those who are themselves slaveholders locate themselves and identify with the most flattering parallels, if you like. So they see themselves like Abraham or Old Testament patriarchs who own enslaved people, or they compare themselves with the slaveholders who Paul would have addressed in his epistles in the New Testament, and they say we are kind of paternalist Christian slaveholders. So the Bible is used. I think it's probably used more effectively by the pro-slavery lobby in the United States than in Britain. So I think in
Yes.
Britain, the religion is most effectively mobilized by the abolitionists. And in particular, in the Caribbean, the planters in the Caribbean are not a very religious lot. So they're very easily stereotyped as godless.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that on the Caribbean plantations, they are extremely wary about the circulation of the Bible among enslaved people. There's actually something called the Slave's Bible, which was produced around about 1807, which is a very carefully curated set of biblical texts which emphasize obedience to masters. They're very worried that if enslaved people have access to the whole of the Bible, this will give them kind of incendiary material. And of course, that is actually what happens in certain slave rebellions, particularly in Demerara in 1823, and then in Jamaica in 1831. There are major slave rebellions which break out from missionary chapels, and it's because enslaved people have got hold of, partly because they're justifying it by appealing to biblical texts.
Amazing. So in a way, I mean, it does underline, well, a few things, but firstly, the kind of the radicalism of the Bible, or the subversive, dangerous nature of the Bible, if kind of if all the Bible is available to someone, and at the same time the efforts that pro slave trade people went to kind of editorialize the Bible, expunge those sections that just didn't were inconvenient to them.
And the Bible is the most authoritative, prestigious text in a Christian civilization. So if you're going to win an argument, you need it on your side. So it's understandable that it is being mobilized very aggressively by both wings here.
Yeah, and I think another thing just worth saying, I think, is that Wilberforce's own diaries were expunged to some extent, weren't they? Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm leading a group, editorial group, who are editing Wilberforce's diaries at the moment, and the surviving manuscript diaries are about almost 1 million words in length. In the 1830s, his sons reproduced about 100,000 words from the diaries, but there was plenty they left out. I mean, understandably, because they were so long. But they downplay certain elements of Wilberforce's career, his connections with dissenters, for example. But also they tend to want to create a very polished image of Wilberforce as an icon. So all of his struggles, his constant complaints about health and servants and children and so on, a lot of that gets airbrushed out because they want to create, an iconic figure whom everybody could admire. So the diaries, show you a much more rounded picture of a human being, warts and all, I suppose.
Yeah, certainly the recollection I had was that Wilberforce comes out to be a much more interesting and radical figure through his own words, and then through the sort of editorialized version that often we have come into contact with, and has been the basis for countless biographies on him. Of course, the background to everything that's going on at this moment in time, John, is historically, that is the French Revolution. And this could be a completely false memory, but I've got the memory of reading something. I think it's a letter that Wilberforce receives, and then in response to that letter, he says something to the effect of, even if I thought what has happened in France, i.e. the French Revolution, was to happen here as a result of my efforts to campaign for the abolition of the slave trade, I would still campaign. I would not be kind of prevented from doing what I'm doing. Firstly, is that right? And secondly, to what extent are some of the arguments that are being used by the abolitionists also arguments that actually undermine the validity of empire?
Okay, yeah. I need to check up on that particular letter, but Wilberforce does.
Sounds like you may have made that up, Paul.
I just don't. I know the diaries much better than I know the correspondence. We're currently cataloguing his correspondence, and we've got a list of 4,500 letters there. So I obviously don't have a recall of them
somewhere in one of those.
Yeah,
I mean, I think if you did say it.
Yeah, well, it has the ring of authenticity in this sense, certainly, that he constantly emphasizes that this is a matter of justice, and therefore it's not just a matter of calculating consequences. So obviously in ethics, you can have a consequentialist approach where you decide what's right and what's wrong on the basis of what might happen if you do this or X or Y, or you can have an approach which says, well, forget the consequences. Is it right or wrong? And Wilberforce, with regard to the slave trade, certainly thinks it's just unjust. It's fundamentally unjust, and therefore there can be no compromise with it, which is why on that question he's opposed even to the idea of gradual abolition of the slave trade. He wants immediate abolition of it.
And this whole thing of the campaign being about the abolition of the trade, and it's only later, after Wilberforce, that there's then the focus on slavery itself. Is there a kind of a moral or a theological rationale for that, or is this just a political pragmatism? In other words, if there's going to be any hope of abolishing slavery, you've got to start with the slave trade. I mean, even if that's not right, was that the logic?
That certainly is the logic for those involved in the parliamentary strategizing. Yeah, and Wilberforce is, on familiar terms with government ministers and with, Pitt, the Prime Minister, and Lord Liverpool after him, and so on. So there's the political logic to it. I think that there's perhaps also a religious sense that it's easier to justify slavery in some sense from the Bible than it is to justify the slave trade and slave trading.
Right.
Though those who justify slavery from the Bible often find it hard to justify the particular kind of slavery that there is in the Caribbean. In other words, a fundamentally racialized form of slavery. They struggle to actually have an effective argument for that and end up thrashing around and appealing to stories like the story of Noah's sons and the curse on Ham and so on, which is, quite strained exegesis in order to justify the enslavement of Africans by Europeans. But I think maybe there is a sense that slavery per se is harder to is easier to justify from the Bible in some sense. But it is a pragmatic argument. I think in terms of your question about empire, Wilberforce and the elite parliamentary abolitionists are imperial reformers, really, so that they're not opposed to empire as such. They think the British Empire has visited immense injustices on other peoples, and they can talk about that and denounce it in extraordinarily powerful terms. So this year's the 200th anniversary of the founding of the Anti-Slavery Society in 1823. And Wilberforce's successor in Parliament, Thomas Fowell Buxton, provides this excoriating denunciation, really, of Britain's sins in supporting slavery and the slave trade over many decades, and says that Britain owes this great atonement for what it's done. But they also are optimistic in the sense that they think that empire can be turned around, empire can become a force for good. And some of this, I think, is to do with their eschatology. And this can be hard to understand now because it's not so widely shared among Protestants. But in this generation, they do tend to be what's known technically as post-millennialists. So they think that the reign of Christ is going to come on earth before the second coming, so that the world will be transformed, slavery will be abolished, war eventually will end, an era of peace and prosperity for all of humanity will be ushered in. So there is a kind of fundamentally optimistic outlook in this generation of reformers, and that perhaps explains why they think that empire can eventually become a vehicle for justice.
So interesting. You talked there about sin, and obviously sin needs to be repented of, which kind of brings us to a lot of the contemporary discussion around reparations, around what we do with the fact that, I mean, I'm not far from Bristol. Grace, you're in Birmingham today. John, you're in Leicester. I mean, those cities are all affected to some extent, I'm assuming, by the kind of the wealth that was generated through the slave trade. And then there's the whole thing around statues and, should we have them up or not if those people were complicit in some way? I mean, do you have a view on this, John? What's your take on some of the kind of thorny contemporary issues?
Yeah. I wrote a Cambridge paper on this a year or so ago about difficult histories and how we think about it. And yeah, it does seem to me we do need to really grapple with these pasts and think about their legacy today. So there perhaps is a tendency to sweep them under the carpet and say, oh, it's all kind of done and dusted. And sometimes those who celebrate the abolitionists most will say that. as if, oh, well, they did the job in the 19th century, so there's, we don't need to think about this anymore. But Buxton, who I just quoted, has this very powerful sense that Britain will have this sort of ongoing moral debt to the territory, to those that it's enslaved. So I think if you think about it in those terms, I think it still makes sense to think in terms of an ongoing moral debt. So yeah, it is something. There's a whole literature and a lot of public debate, obviously, around all of these issues. But I do think they're ones we need to take seriously.
Yeah, interesting. It's interesting you referencing some of those other Enlightenment historical figures at the beginning, and I suppose it just draws attention to the fact that individuals are complex, that they're neither wholly virtuous nor wholly evil, and all of those figures, have their kind of their high points and low points, don't they? And I suppose knowing what to do with that, how to kind of appraise that, is a challenge. And of course, the other thing is slavery is a big deal today, isn't it? I mean, I think that's the other thing that I'm kind of really struck by, that the number of people enslaved in the world today, I think it's something like 50 million was a figure that I read from a few years ago. So nearly 1 in every 150 people in the world are enslaved. Now, if that is right, or even if it was kind of half right, do you think there are any lessons that we can draw on from people like Wilberforce and perhaps other members of the Clapham sect in terms of how they campaigned and how they dealt with this issue, and then how we should ourselves within our context in this time?
Yeah, there's an interesting book written a number of years ago by an American sociologist called James Davison Hunter, called "To Change the World." He's actually most famous for coining or for popularizing the phrase "culture wars," which is, of course, with us everywhere now. But he wrote a book called "To Change the World," which is basically thinking about social transformation and how Christians have tried to enact social transformation. It's interesting. He appeals to the Clapham sect around Wilberforce as an example here, because he thinks he thinks Christians are often quite naive about how easy it is to change the world. And there's a lot of talk about transformation, but it's actually exceptionally difficult. And of course, a lot of the critics of the abolitionists would say this, that they would emphasize nowadays the limits of their achievement. But the point Hunter wants to make is that transformation does often require elites. So it does often require figures in strategic places. Though I think one of the interesting things about the British abolitionist movement is the way it manages to combine and to mobilize different constituencies in the movement, and that they play a different role in different ways. And this is probably true of successful social movements in the 21st century as well. So there are those elites who are very well placed in Westminster and Whitehall and so on. But there's also a grassroots popular movement. And whenever they run into a barrier with the politicians, they can appeal, they can engage in major petitioning campaigns, for example. So grassroots abolitionism is a major phenomenon. The other very striking feature about abolitionism in Britain and America is the way in which black activists also are involved. So those, if you like, who are victims, who've been victimized by slavery, become quite significant players in their own right. That's particularly true of black abolitionists in America, but also, of course, enslaved people in the Caribbean, not least through slave revolts and protests. So there's a sense in which those who are seen as victims end up playing a role there. And that kind of undermines a purely paternalist view of how social reform is brought about, that actually thinking in a more active way about the agency of those who've been victimized. And I think that is true of those anti-trafficking movements today, for example, that people who have been trafficked themselves often end up playing quite an important role in it. I think maybe a broader point to make is that the combination of idealism is combined with pragmatism in this social movement. So they're very hard-headed in the way in which they approach Parliament, but also in the way in which they assemble coalitions, and they're willing to work across party lines. I think that's another quite significant factor. So the abolitionist movement brings people together who are Anglicans, but also dissenters in a coalition. It also brings people together across what becomes eventually dubbed the Tory Whig line in British politics, and Wilberforce and others are very intentional, I think, about that. So there's a kind of a practical coalition building, and which is a very striking feature of the movement.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah, I think I think the whole conversation, as you say, there's so much complexity to it, but actually, I think you've really helpfully sort of taken us on the journey of back from Wilberforce, but actually, as you say, sort of bringing it into today, and actually how there aren't simple answers to do we take down statues or not. But I think you've definitely given us more than the history lesson that I had at school. So I'm very grateful for that. Yeah, I know it's encouraging. So thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much. I'm conscious we've covered a really big subject, and
we
there's
have.
more that could be said, but hopefully there's some useful thoughts there. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
I mean, we'd love to have you back, John. Just one thing before you go, just tell us something about Wilberforce's kind of relationship with the Bible, because that's a big deal, isn't it? And we've got some evidence, haven't we, of literally how he engages with it. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, it's interesting. The diaries don't say so much about which passages he's reading. They will sort of refer in general. That they'll give the text that the preacher preaches on a Sunday. That's quite common. But we do have some of his annotated Bibles, so they're very interesting in terms of the features that he's picking up in his biblical reading. There's also a very interesting passage in the diaries in the late 1810s, and he's worried that basically they've not attacked slavery directly, and one of the reasons he's bothered by this is that they're making no progress with the Caribbean assemblies, the colonial assemblies, who are blocking any kind of reform or amelioration of slavery. But he's also bothered by what he reads in the biblical prophets and their denunciation of injustice towards the poor and the weak and the orphan and so on. That's an interesting example, I think, of how biblical texts are playing on his mind. And I think that is quite a common feature among abolitionists in Britain and America, that they really are troubled by some of these denunciations of injustice in the biblical prophets, and they think, are we being too complacent?
Brilliant, amazing. Thank you so much, John. I really have enjoyed the conversation. Really grateful to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great to be on.
So, Grace, what did you think of the conversation? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it was very interesting. There was a lot of content in there, wasn't there, in terms of history, contemporary life today. I did have one question for you, Paul, actually, which is slightly off. Well, it's not off topic, actually. Which my question was, how long did it take you to read William Wilberforce's diaries? Because from the amount of words that John referred to in there, I'm thinking it must have been quite a sizable chunk of time.
Yeah, I think it was, it might have been almost a year. I mean, basically, it was for the period that I was doing the PhD. I was reading his diaries for most of that time. I mean, not always only doing that, but doing that. I was obviously doing it part-time. But the interesting thing is, because he had such bad eyesight as well, his handwriting is, I mean,
shocking.
It's awful, but it gets worse. It deteriorates.
Okay.
So thankfully, these are being typed up.
Okay.
And so increasingly, I was relying on the transcript of them. But it is extraordinary. And as John was saying as well, the extraordinary thing is when you look at Wilberforce's diaries, you see his little marginal notes and comments. You can kind of really see him kind of engaging with it.
Yeah.
But his eyesight was a real problem, and his handwriting was a problem. I suppose they might be related to each other. The other thing that you'll be interested in, Grace, is his kind of he was a poor administrator, so he would
They're
receive,
the worst.
hundreds of letters, and he just kind of bag them up and forget about them.
Wow.
And then he would reply to a letter, not realizing that it was kind of 5 letters since the first letter had kind of gone, sort of thing.
Oh, so he missed a huge amount. He could have done
So
with a
yeah,
good
so
PA or executive assistant then, by the sounds of
he
it.
probably, I mean, he could have afforded one, but he he
True.
obviously didn't. So
True.
I don't
No,
know.
that's
But
interesting.
anyway,
I was
you
just
digress, don't you,
I
Grace?
do digress, but I was just when you said it, I was thinking, wonder how long that took. No, but back to the conversation. I thought it was interesting because, if I'm honest, in all seriousness, other than a history lesson at school, or maybe a few of them, and then I suppose, yeah, sort of back in 2020 when all of this stuff did kick off with statues, I feel like it's very easy to forget and sort of shameful to forget actually quite how big and, in a negative sense, impactful the slave trade has been. And I think I was sort of doing a bit of research before this, just about, as you mentioned, I'm based in Birmingham, and just about sort of what in the city of Birmingham has in some way been as a result of, or sort of represents part of the slave trade. And I read this really interesting thing about, there's a statue, I think it's called the Golden Boys, and it was removed from the city centre, partly for some building work actually, and then it was only when it was about to be put back in that there was sort of this uproar of, hang on a minute, do we actually know what this statue is about? And it is, I can't, as I say, embarrassingly remember the names, but it was 3 men basically who were all very instrumental and influential in, as I think, being slave owners themselves. And so since, what they've done is they've put it back, but they've put a plaque next to it, basically educating people and basically just acknowledging, this is a historic statue. It represents people, and it's important to know, because I think part of the issue and why people kind of kicked off with the statues is because people just had no idea that these statues that are around our cities actually represent something truly awful. And I thought that was for me, it was that thing of actually, whilst probably very few of us are going to go on to be figures like William Wilberforce, there is something about actually understanding, whether it's where we live or just the context of the slave trade. And I think obviously today was a really interesting conversation because, John was so knowledgeable, but also I suppose my challenge to us would be, I'm sure there is stuff to find out about where we live, the streets that we're on, the people that kind of have made it as it is today. So they're sort of not fully formed thoughts, but a few local thoughts and reflections. How about you, Paul? What was your, obviously quite a lot more about Wilberforce, but what were your reflections, having also then listened to what John had to share?
Yes, well, I was really interested just now in what you were saying, Grace, because I think this whole issue around statues is really interesting, and it is quite complex. And I suppose instinctively, I'm always a bit uneasy about the kind of taking statues down, partly because I think there's a danger that then that denies history.
Yeah.
And the danger is, if you deny history, you don't learn the lessons from history. And I suppose the other thing is recognizing that most figures, and we talked about this a little bit, are complex. So, if you think of current statues that exist, even within Parliament Square, for example, even, extraordinary figures like Mandela or Gandhi are not kind of without controversy. They're not kind of all virtuous. I mean, they were complex personalities as well. So I think I'm really interested, and I think, if you like, the Birmingham solution, let's call it that, that sounds like a good solution to me, because it is, if you like, acknowledging what has happened, but it's also explaining it, which I think is really important. I think for me with John, I mean, I thought he came across really well, and he's, was very kind of cogent in the way he responded to some of the things we were asking him. But I suppose the headlines for me would be that a recognition that the abolition of the slave trade didn't end slavery, but it did mark the beginning of the end. And obviously then, the end of slavery. Well, in a sense, I mean, kind of slavery might be illegal, but the reality is we've got this huge problem in terms of global slavery today. And I suppose I was kind of challenged then by almost the encouragement to perseverance and activism that John talked about. I suppose the second thing that struck me perhaps more strongly than it has is that I don't think we can understand the abolition of the slave trade and then ultimately slavery without reference to the Christian story. I mean, that was so significant, whether it was to the Quakers or the evangelicals, the Clapham set. That was a massive deal. You know, it was so significant. And I suppose also what is interesting when we have these sorts of conversations is subjects and people are always even more interesting than we think we might be. So, you know, some of the little anecdotes around Wilberforce I thought were really interesting. I mean, that comparison between Wilberforce at 5 foot and Thomas Clarkson at 6'3" or whatever he was. I mean, you can just imagine them walking through Parliament. I mean, you know, it would have looked ridiculous and probably would have been caricatured through, you know, cartoonists and the like. So, I thought it's a really interesting conversation.
I think the challenge is sort of how do we, I was sort of reflecting briefly just now that actually, as I say, we're probably not going to go on to be Wilberforces ourselves, but actually there will be things, you know, not necessarily linked to slavery, but there will be things in our own spheres and front lines that actually, that, you know, as you said, as John was saying, there was a level of courage, and I can't remember the phrase he used, but it was something about basically being quite direct and radical in our response to things that are not right, or that maybe it's things that we read in the Bible that we know, and we don't see those things in our, you know, workplaces or our homes or our families. And actually, I think I'm inspired by someone like Wilberforce of whatever the, you know, insert issue is in our own daily lives. There is an element of seeing what we read in the Bible, and actually there is a call to action, isn't there, of what does that look like for us to, whether it's speak up or you know, it's all to do with it's justice at the end of the day, isn't it, and what's kind of God's heart for our world and the people around us. And so I suppose, as I say, whilst I can't necessarily see, and as you say, there is modern day slavery happening, so I'm definitely not suggesting it's not happening, but in terms of from what I can see and how somebody like Wilberforce, there are parallels, aren't there, of how he acted and he sort of moved forward in that campaigning that you know, I suppose in maybe slightly more micro ways are perhaps what we will be called to do at different points in our life.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing there I thought was really relevant for us today is this cross-party thing that he talked about. So the idea that ultimately part of the success of the abolitionist campaign, certainly in Parliament, was that, and I'm sure across the country, was that it drew from people across political tribes. And I think that's a reminder that, you know, the bigger the problem, the more important that is. And in a day when our politics seems so broken in so many ways, you know, wouldn't it be great if we saw some more of that happen across a range of the kind of the big issues that face us?
Absolutely.
Yeah, good conversation. I enjoyed that. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you. I think we maybe we should leave it there for today, Paul. Do you reckon?
I think that's a good idea. If listeners and I guess viewers, there may be one or two of you. It's great to see you. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Whole Life, we'd love you to subscribe. We'd love you to leave a review and tell your friends all about it.
That's right. But until next time, from Grace and Paul, that was The Whole Life. Goodbye.